Well, now that we have our app ready to go, we've debugged it, tested, analyzed it, put the app icons in it, put the launch images in it. We're ready to go with this app. But there's always one more thing. You need to build your app for distribution, and there's a process involved. I mean, even though you have your app working on the simulator and you're as happy as a virtual clam, you will get this urge to see what it looks like on the iPhone or iPad itself. Now, assuming you've joined the developer program the way I talked about earlier, in order to download the SDK, you need to run through a few hoops still to get that app to run on an actual iPhone or iPad. Benjamin Franklin once said, "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." And here's another certainty in this earthly vale of tears. Everybody has to jump through the same hoops to get the app onto an iPhone or iPad, and also to get that app into the App Store. Nobody much likes jumping through hoops, but there they are. For most developers, getting their apps to run on the iPhone or iPad during development can be one of the most frustrating things about developing software. The sticking point has to do with a technical concept called code signing, a rather complicated process designed to ensure the integrity of the code and positively identify the code's originator. Apple requires all iOS apps to be digitally signed with a signing certificate. It has to be one issued by Apple to a registered iPhone or iPad developer. And this is before the app can run on a development system such as an iPhone or iPad, and before it is submitted to the App Store for distribution to the public. The signature authenticates the identity of the developer of the app and ensures that no changes have been made to the app after it was signed. As to why this is a big deal, here's the short answer. Code signing is your way of guaranteeing that no bad guys have done anything to your code that can harm the innocent user. Okay, so here's the development and distribution process. Okay, so nobody really likes the process, but it's doable and certainly worth the trouble. Now, you basically have to go through two processes, one for development and one for distribution. Both produce different but similarly named certificates and profiles, and that can be confusing. Let's start backwards and talk about the distribution process first. So before you can build a version of your app that actually runs on other people's iPhones and iPads, Apple insists that you have the following: a distribution certificate and a distribution provisioning profile. The certificate is an electronic document that associates a digital identity with other information that you've provided that identifies you, and that includes your name, email address, or business. The distribution certificate is placed on your keychain in your computer. The keychain is, of course, the place that stores passwords, keys, and certificates. Now, a distribution provisioning profile is something that Xcode builds into your application, creating a kind of code fingerprint that acts as a unique digital signature. Now, after you've built your app for distribution, you then send it to Apple for approval and distribution. Apple verifies the signature to be sure that the code came from a registered developer, that means you, and that it hasn't been corrupted. Apple then adds its own digital signature to your signed app. iOS runs only apps that have a digital signature. Doing it this way ensures iPhone and iPad owners that the apps they download from the App Store have been written by registered developers and have not been altered in any way since the apps were created. In addition to a distribution provisioning profile, you can also create what's called an ad hoc provisioning profile, which lets you distribute your app to up to 100 devices. And that's usually reserved for enterprises that want to distribute in-house apps or schools that want to distribute apps to the students, and those are custom apps. So although the system for getting apps on other people's iPhones and iPads works pretty well, leaving aside the fact that Apple essentially has veto rights on every app that comes its way, developers still face some significant consequences. No mechanism exists for testing your app on the device it's going to run. You can't run your app on an actual device until it's been code signed by Apple, but Apple is hardly going to code sign anything that's not working correctly. And secondly, even if Apple did sign an app that had yet to run on an iPhone or iPad, that would mean an additional hassle. Every time you recompiled, you'd have to upload the app to the App Store and have it code signed again, and then download it to your device. So that's a bit of a catch-22. To solve the problem, Apple created a development process. And what they did is develop a process for creating a development certificate as opposed to a distribution certificate, and also a development provisioning profile. To help you through this process, Apple provides a development provisioning assistant. Now, the first place you would go to work with this assistant is the developer's iOS provisioning portal. You would log in as developer. If you went to the Member Center first, which is over here, let's go there, you would see that you can get right to the provisioning profile right here. So you just click on that. Here we are at the provisioning portal. This assistant will create a development provisioning profile and development certificate so that you can build and install the apps you're developing on your own iOS devices, your iPhone and your iPad. This profile, provisioning profile, the development provisioning profile, needs to be installed on each device on which you want to run your app for testing. So in other words, you can't run your app on just any iPhone or iPad. It has to be one that already has the development provisioning profile installed on it. Now, of course, a single device can contain multiple development provisioning profiles. So you could continue to share an iPhone or an iPad over multiple projects. But a development provisioning profile is tied to a single device and a developer. But of course, even with your provisioning profile in place, when you compile your program, Xcode will build and sign and create the required signature for your app only if it finds one of those development certificates in your keychain. So that means you always need both the development provisioning profile and the development certificates. Now, I'm not going to launch the assistant here because it takes a few minutes and you have to connect an iPhone or iPad while you're doing it. And I certainly am not going to go through the process of showing you how to do a development certificate. That's something you really have to do in the portal. As you can see, your certificates show up here in the portal. And I have mine. And your devices show up here. So let's go back to the home. So the process is kind of like filling out taxes, but you have to follow the rules or you can face some dire consequences. Essentially, if you don't follow the rules, you will not get your app onto the device and you eventually won't get it into the App Store. Assuming you've done this provisioning here and you've got your development provisioning profiles, you're ready for distribution. You will follow this process to distribute the application. Configure the profile, download and install the provisioning profile, build and distribute your app, and upload it to the App Store. The information for doing that is right here spelled out for you in the iOS provisioning portal. Now, after you've downloaded the distribution profile, added your app icons, launch images, and everything else, you can build your app for distribution rather than just building it for testing purposes. The way you build an app for distribution is to first choose a scheme. The scheme pop-up menu right here specifies which targets, actual products to build, what build configuration to use when building them, which debugger to use when testing them, and which executable to launch when running them on the device. You can create your own schemes and edit any of the schemes that come with your project, but usually all you'll need to do is choose the scheme that works for you. In this case, it would be an iOS device. So now we've chosen iOS device as the active scheme. We select My World at the very top of the project navigator, and under the project heading, we select My World. A summary pane here shows some things that we need to look at. Under the Info tab, if the build settings are appearing, then you want to jump over back to the Info tab by clicking Info. The Info pane provides the basic information about the project. The most important setting, which is already set for you, is the pop-up menu for selecting the version of iOS for iOS deployment target, right here. You should pick the current version of iOS to make sure your app is properly built for the version that people are using on their iPhones and iPads. Next, click the Build Settings tab to see the Build Settings pane. Now, there's a section here called Code Signing. You can open it and close it this way. Here is where you make sure that the iPhone or iPad distribution profile is already selected in the pop-up menu. We have, for debugging, the iPhone developer selected. For release, however, we would want to select iPhone distribution here. So we've set the code signing identity for the released version of the app. At this point, you would choose Product Run from the main menu to build and run the app on your iPhone. Or you'd click the Tasks button here. So when you've done all of this elaborate but necessary song and dance, you're ready to rock and roll. But you should test your app on your iPhone or iPad first. Now, after you've tested it thoroughly, you can use Xcode to create an archive to submit it to the App Store. An archive is a compressed package of all the app's files. It's just simpler to upload. And all you need to do if your app is ready and your code sign is set up is choose Product Archive. So after choosing Product Archive, Xcode creates an archive of your project using the build configuration and the name specified in the archive pane of the scheme editor, which is the default, the product name. Your archive shows up in the Organizer window, which you can see by choosing Organizer. And once it's there, all you need to do is click the Archives tab. There are no archives yet, but you would click the Archives tab, select it, and click Submit Application to iTunes Connect. In the dialog that would appear, you'd enter your developer name and password and click Submit. So once you've done that, once you've archived and submitted your app, you would want to jump straight to the iTunes Connect page, which you can get to from the Member Center here in the Developer Center. And that's where you would submit and manage your app on the App Store. iTunes is your entryway to the App Store and to manage your apps. And this is what it looks like. I will explain that in the next section.